very good afternoon to all the distinguished guests and the panelists here. This session is titled Civil Society Movements, Can They Strengthen Federalism? There's been an extensive and very enlightening discussion about federalism and its various dimensions in the first session. And without much further ado, I would like to start the question-answer session with the panelists. First, I would ask Brinda, when we talk about civil society, what comes to your mind? Or who comes to your mind?
I think civil society is all of us, and the politicians and the bureaucrats and everybody put together. But somewhere along the line, I think we civilians got relegated to the sidelines, and we continue to be relegated over there. And yet, if federalism is alive today, is kicking and alive today, it is because of us who have been on the sidelines and refused to be there on the sidelines, demanding accountability from the people to whom we have vested powers and to the people to whom we pay our taxes as their salaries. So I think that, for me, is who civil society is all about. You and me, the paymasters.
Okay. Meera?
Needs to be looked at in the broadest sense of the term, and I think many times we sort of look at, because there's also, we are living in the time of Andolan Jivis, as many of us are referred to, whereas it's quite the opposite, and I kind of concur with Brinda that an overwhelming majority of this country, the Shoshit, Vanchit, the oppressed sections and the ordinary citizens who are part of the bedrock of this democracy, are part of the civil society of this country. But then there are different layers of how active different sections of citizenry are. So that would reflect in terms of how effective the civil society itself is. And many times there is also an understanding in terms of looking at civil society. It also depends on who comes from which background probably. So civil society for someone might only mean NGOs, or for someone else might mean certain movements from an ideological framework, but one will have to look at it in the broadest sense, and a whole range of democratic interventions, initiatives, organizations, ranging from the individual to collectives, which, and including, at times, although definitely probably not larger parties, but the most smaller parties which are trying hard to sustain democracy. Civil society can probably broadly include this entire range, but I for one would definitely think within this entire spectrum, the role that people's struggles and people's movements play is extremely central in keeping democracy alive. And I would just want to give one, and since also that's the most recent example in the context of saving federalism, the historic farmer struggle that we saw in the past couple of years, and how questioning on the one hand large corporate forces, and on the other hand the asserting the principle of federalism, we saw a historic farmers movement. Probably many times we won't look at the Kisan Andolan, the farmers movement, as civil society, but it is one of the most significant examples in recent times of upholding federalism. And I think therefore we have to look at the whole civil society in its widest possible imagination.
From what you have said, I could gather two aspects to the answer. One is the institutional phase of it, like NGOs and community-based organizations, registered non-profits and things like that. The other is the spontaneous variety. What we have seen in farmers' agitations, and also CA, NRC, and so on. When it comes to looking at these two streams, how do you look at, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this kind of, Brinda, you can go, or what are the strengths? Is the institutional variety in the long run better intervention in terms of assuring federalism or strengthening federalism, or the spontaneous response to issues that comes from the street, as we have seen CAA and RC?
The institutions that have been created and that are vested with authority and power is to uphold the democracy, federalism, and the rights of people. Now, the fact that civil society is coming onto the street and our struggles are being manifested, putting ourselves into a lot of trouble is the question we want to ask. So what are politicians there for? What is the bureaucracy there for? What are all of these institutions there for if I have to come onto the street to demand that you do the job that I am paying you to do? Or you do the job for what I elected you into power for? So these institutions and mechanisms are the ones who primarily must deliver, and they are not delivering. And that is why civil society is out there. And like Meera pointed out, different kinds of civil society movements, we are out there demanding that these institutions work. I mean, why should it be my job to ask them to work when they came there in the first place saying, please put me there because I will do this job? So institutions must do their job, and if they are not doing it, it becomes our responsibility to hold them accountable and challenge them as to why they are not doing what they are supposed to be doing. So right now, the kind of scenario that my country is presented with, civil society seems to be the hope, this beacon of hope that is there to make these institutions work. And I think the strategies that civil society is adopting, we are being pushed, literally pushed to the edges. Everything that we say and do today, we have to be scared. And these institutions have no right to make us feel scared. And this civil society cannot be mantled with this scare and fear and threat of these organizations who are actually there to look after us and our well-being.
Yeah. Meera? The question was about structured interventions through NGOs and registered organizations and the spontaneity of people's response.
So I'll try to address it at two levels. One is also looking at the broader context that we are in today. One is of fascism that all of us are, I mean, it's actually at the doorstep and we are all facing it in different levels. And the second is of different authoritarianisms. I mean, even if a certain party, let's just name it, I mean, is not non-BJP parties, but then they could be in their own spheres, they could be authoritarian in different ways or in terms of different interventions that they, or policy decisions that they take. So, to be honest, if one looks at who is the permanent opposition, it is the people. It is the people's organizations, it is the civil society, it is the democratic struggles who are located in that, who are positioned in that frame of being the permanent opposition and also resisting fascism and also questioning other forms of authoritarian governments or decisions. So this is the larger framework. And within that, I think it is interesting definitely to look at these various formations because we all know that there are these there's a spectrum of different collectives that are part of civil society. And there are different histories too, and also, as Padmaja rightly asked, strengths and limitations to both. At one level, institutionalized approach of civil society to challenges posed by the government, or many times, in fact, a significant section of civil society also, quote-unquote, engages with the government. Many times it can be meaningful engagement. Many times it could also be constructive engagement. And that definitely has its value. And these kinds of engagement in our country, for instance, if you look at a whole range of progressive laws, the laws were not just passed in the parliament. I mean, the passage of the law in the parliament or the assemblies is the ultimate thing. But preceded by it is a whole history of struggle or a history of engagement with the legislators, with various sections to make sure that the promise, the constitutional guarantees are translated into reality through a statutory law. So at one level, there are those kinds of interventions which are necessary. But at the other level, one would also think that a very institutionalized framing of how civil society looks at itself might not always be helpful in terms of responding to multiple challenges, and therefore also we have an extremely rich history of people's struggles in this country, which are not, I mean, their structure is not written in stone basically, but they have been flexible enough to be able to respond to challenges by the state, to state repression, or to various significant social and political questions. So one wouldn't say whether it's an either or between these different formats of organizations. All have their value, but I would just want to add over here that it's also important to look at within the broader framework of it ultimately, I think, also boils down to, a lot of this boils down to power. Power is not just with those who are voted into power electorally, but power is everywhere in society. Caste is power, social access to different kinds of social privileges is power, and there is of course also power prevalent within the civil society spaces, NGO spaces, etc. So one, I think, also has to be very alive to the various to the existence of different forms of power, and also how at one level, whether it is the larger power of capital itself, and how capital has the power, especially in the last 3 decades, we've seen in this country how capitalism and neoliberal frameworks have co-opted the NGOs and co-opted civil society, have begun to use the same kind of jargon, but actually diluted so many of the, I mean, if one looks at the struggles of the 70s and 80s and the very significant political questions of those decades and how they've been diluted over time, there is, I think, also much for quote-unquote civil society to also reflect upon, and therefore why mass movements and mass uprisings have a very significant role in questioning how capitalism infiltrates all our spaces, also using very progressive language.
There has been, when we listen to discussions about federalism and decentralized democracy and things like that, we often hear sad note of disappointment in India. People are sometimes alarmed and sometimes dismayed at what is going on. Over the years, before this phase, there was a lot of institutionalization of civil society organizations, NGOs, and they have become bureaucracies in their own right. The state was a bureaucracy by nature, the decision-making process and what it does. And the NGO sector was its own kind of third sector bureaucracy that was a thing. But suddenly in this later phase, right now, what we are seeing, by discarding the basic constitutional values and by setting aside the federal respect for the federalist agenda, the state has become very agile. The state has become very agile because it is no longer bound by some frameworks. Are we ready, and the NGO sector and the civil society, to match that agility of the state, the newfound agility of the state in actually?
So I think, again, one is if we look at the macro context of what we are up against, and again, I mean, a whole set of, in the previous session as well, I think there was a very good reference to centralization as a phenomena, which is becoming even more grounded in the overall governance models, and we see it through a variety of a whole host of interventions, policies, laws. I mean, you just name it, and then you have centralization very much integral into the, whether it's the new economic policy, whether it is the Electricity Amendment Act was mentioned, so on and so forth. There are so many such, I mean, the fish workers have been fighting on the whole ports question. So there are all these, there are different constituencies which have been fighting and organizing, and therefore I think it's also important to acknowledge how not only, I mean, many times people's organizations and struggles might not be using the word federalism in that sense, but the spirit with which the struggle is organized on the ground is to actually uphold that federal spirit, is to uphold decentralization in its real sense at the grassroots level. And many times when we also speak of federalism, I think the framework gets limited to very explicit reference to federalism and structures that are mentioned in the Constitution. But also it is important to look at local governance mechanisms, and of course, I mean, there is a reference to that in the Constitution, and there's been a whole struggle also to actualize it on the ground, but we also see how there have been constant systemic compromises and challenges in actuating governance at that level. So the reason I'm also mentioning this is, you look at the struggles that keep happening from below at the micro levels, which question macro policy and which challenge the impact that macro policies try to bring upon struggles from the below. And at the other level, you also see how many times it's so hard for people's organizations or struggles to actually get a broader support of, and here I'm talking beyond the limited way in which we look at civil society, to also get political solidarity, because at the end of the day, we are in this parliamentary democracy framework. So it is extremely important to be able to garner support from a whole range of political actors and parties as well. But sadly, what happens is, and we are in fact seeing that even now, even today in times of fascism, of course, I mean, a lot more parties have begun to speak out and challenge, because the ED is at your doorstep, the CBI is at your doorstep, so how can the NIA is coming after you, so how can you not speak out? But it is also, I think, this really needs reflection, because the terms on which political actors, political parties engage or respond, and the terms on which civil society and other democratic groups respond are very different, right? Many times political parties are all the time looking at their own arithmetic. वो हिंदी में कहते हैं अपना गणित देखते हैं. So they're looking at their arithmetic, they're looking at saving their own bastion, and only when they face the heat or when they think that me speaking out or making an intervention will actually help in a certain way, then they would take that position or respond, which is very different from how democratic groups and civil society is constantly struggling all the time. So I would just say, if we have to fight to sustain federalism and in fact deepen the spirit of federalism as enshrined in the Constitution, which I think Professor Gopal excellently spoke about in the first session, it would require a lot more of effort, and with all respect to civil society and people's struggles and all, I would still think there is only so much that can be done by those who are not directly within the parliamentary democratic framework, and it is time, and today is the time for all kinds of parties and groups who believe that we cannot be a one nation, one religion, one everything, including one fertilizer, which was being referred to actually speak out much more, and also within our own states. I mean, here sitting in Telangana, I think it's also important to say, there was a struggle, and Padmaja and so many friends sitting here know, there was a struggle to get back Dharna Chowk. How do you look at this, right? I mean, a state which was born out of struggle, then kind of clamps down on the Dharna Chowk. So there are, I think, also these layers that we need to look at, and also it is important to, within your own states also, you have to respect and ensure that opposition thrives. If we are going to, within our own political spaces or states, if we are going to not allow opposition to nurture, whether it is political party opposition or civil society opposition, then there is, I mean, the fascists are coming after us, they will come after you also, right? So in that sense, it is important to value opposition, different forms of opposition, which has, I'm not talking of BJP here, we are being very clear, because BJP is not, I mean, they are only in opposition to the Constitution, so they can't be an opposition in the real sense of the democratic framework. But one is talking of other political organizations and entities who, if they are committed to the Constitution, must really stand with civil society, stand with the principles that civil society and democratic groups are fighting for, which includes very significantly federalism in each and every of our struggles.